they had other similarities. They were both very ambitious, and they were both consummate politicians. We don't always think of Lincoln as a politician. Believe me, he was a politician. And that's one of the things that I admire so greatly about him. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Just to continue this theme a little bit, I ran across a quote from an historian by the name of Max Lerner, who wrote this in 1940, which is the period about which I write. He's comparing Lincoln and FDR. He said, "I know that in externals they are poles apart. In the one an easy graciousness, in the other a clumsy grace. The one modern, alert, cosmopolitan, and the other a backwoodsman, even for his own day. The one aristocrat, the other plebeian. Yet the resemblances are real. Each of them managed somehow to catch the accents and express the aspiration of events, to complete an interior crisis out of which his real greatness emerged. Lincoln was a brooding man of thought, whom the Civil War compelled to action. Roosevelt is a man of action, whom the crisis of the Depression years and the international collapse have compelled to thought. The more memorable figure is undoubtedly Lincoln, the more effective president, probably Roosevelt." And we could have a good debate on that. But I just thought it was a very interesting observation from the time that Roosevelt was president. This book that I have written really deals with why and how FDR decided to run for an unprecedented third term in 1940. No president had ever succeeded in running for a third term, and he didn't want to do it. He was planning to retire to his beloved Hyde Park, and so I spent a lot of time trying to get into his head, because unlike all of his successors, except for John Kennedy, he kept no memoirs. He didn't have intimate friends. There was no record. There was no record. So I had to take the spare record that existed and make of it what I could. Just let me set the scene in September of 1939, when he had come into he was suffering from the same kind of second-term curse that other presidents, including our current one, are suffering from to some extent. It happens to almost every president, the second term. The New Deal had run its course, and he was already shifting gears from domestic policy to foreign policy. And as I say, he planned to retire. But in September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and that changed the equation. Great Britain and France declared war, and FDR struggled with a way to try to find a way to help Britain and France, because he was convinced that if Britain and France fell, Hitler would turn his eyes to the Western Hemisphere, and that war would come to the United States. Increasingly, he believed that war was coming to the United States. His goal was to put it off, to prepare the country, and to help Britain and France be what he called the first line of defense. This was not an easy thing to do, because he couldn't really influence events in Europe, because the United States had no military capability, and we were not a credible factor in foreign affairs. And more importantly, the country was heavily isolationist. It's hard to believe now, but the Congress and the country were both heavily isolationist, and they thought giving aid to Britain, for example, was putting the country on a slippery slope to war. There was great opposition to it. He shaped this policy all by himself. He didn't have a National Security Council. He didn't have anybody. You have to believe that there was no substantive staff in the White House. All he had was the State Department, and so he did it by himself. He had no formal intelligence organization. As often as not, he got his intelligence anecdotally. A Harvard classmate would return from Europe and he'd call him in and say, "What have you seen and heard?" And at the same time, he was under growing pressure to state his intentions as whether he would run for a third term, and he wouldn't say. So there's two storylines in this book. One is the war breaking out in Europe, and the other is the question of whether he'll run for a third term. And he never talked to a soul about that. Many people assumed he was always running, but I don't agree. There's no evidence to suggest that. On the contrary, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he made specific plans to retire. And as I say, he made this decision entirely alone. He was a famously social person. He wanted to have people around him all the time, even when it was tense, maybe especially when the situation was tense. And yet at the same time, he was a very solitary man. He grew up as an only child in a remote estate without many friends, and he became very self-reliant. And that's what characterized FDR through most of his life, indeed into his presidency. So what did I learn about FDR in this process? Well, I learned that he was, as I say, a loner. Eleanor said his wife Eleanor said he had no real confidence, not even me, she said. One of his biographers, Robert Sherwood, who I'll come back to him because he was a playwright and became a speechwriter for FDR. He won the Pulitzer Prize for writing Abe Lincoln in Illinois. Big hit in the 1930s, in the 1940s, actually. He wrote in his biography that FDR had a thickly forested interior. Just imagine that. A thickly forested. He didn't want anybody to penetrate that forest, which I thought was a marvelously descriptive phrase. There was a duality to FDR, and this is where there's some similarity again to Abraham Lincoln. FDR was bold and perceptive, and he was a prescient and I think moral statesman. He set very lofty and principled goals, and yet in pursuit of those goals, he could be cautious, ambitious, sometimes manipulative, sometimes duplicitous, and we saw that those characteristics also to a lesser extent, I think, in the Spielberg movie on Lincoln, where he was trying to enact the 13th Amendment. There could be no more principled goal. And yet he was out buying votes. Pretty crass. But he figured that he needed to do that to achieve this. And so that they weren't the first two politicians to come by this practice. But he did it. So let me take you up to June of 1940. Hitler had invaded the Low Countries in France. This is blitzkrieg. France fell very quickly, and Britain was hanging on by a thread. Eleanor encouraged FDR to hold a meeting with a group of about 50 young people. They were fairly liberal young people. The reason was that he had had a similar meeting in February with such a group, and it didn't go well because he thought they were naive and rude, and he wasn't as patient as he wished he had been. And so this is kind of his move to make amends. And this is a fairly long excerpt, but bear with me because it really, I think it's the single most important part of my book that deals with Abraham Lincoln. We're in the East Room of the White House, and there's a group of about 50 or 60 people, just like there are here tonight. FDR, Eleanor, and Harry Hopkins are sitting on the stage up front, and here's the way it goes. They're asking all kinds of questions. You know, why do we have to have this war mobilization? I mean, why keep the New Deal going, put people back to work? And there's a lot of talk about discrimination in the South. These were idealistic young people, and they were raising very good questions. No president occupies the White House without being constantly reminded that Abraham Lincoln once lived there and grappled with the most fundamental questions the nation could face. Roosevelt was seated just down the hall from George Healy's large portrait of the 16th president pondering some great issue. Upstairs in the residence was not only Lincoln's bedroom, but also his study, currently occupied by the man seated next to him, Harry Hopkins. And in the East Room itself, where they sat, the body of the martyred president had lain in state. As a student of history, FDR knew Lincoln well. He was particularly mindful of Lincoln's famous 1864 letter to Albert G. Hodges of Kentucky, explaining his position on slavery, and which concluded with a stark admission. "I confess not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me," close quote. President Roosevelt did not cite the quotation to his young audience, though it had been uppermost in his mind for some time. But he did talk about the, quote, great struggle Lincoln had had with himself between trying to preserve the Union, as he had sworn to do, and confronting the evil of slavery. Lincoln had known the two great issues were related, FDR said, but on assuming the presidency, he had to put off dealing with slavery to concentrate first on restoring the Union. He had been compelled to wait on events that would permit him to join the two great causes into one. So too must FDR wait on events to deal with other questions later. An unidentified young man, eager to speak for his colleagues, if not for his entire generation, rose and did so at length, covering most of the issues already raised in an articulate and testy oration, laced with more than a little arrogance. Again, Roosevelt listened patiently. When the young man finally concluded, the president asked him if he had read Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, the final volume of which had been recently published. The entire work would be awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1940. When the young man conceded he had not, Roosevelt summarized it for him. Quote, "I think the impression was that Lincoln was a pretty sad man because he couldn't do all he wanted to do at one time. And I think you will find examples where Lincoln had to compromise to make a few gains. This made him, quote, one of those unfortunate people called a politician." Lincoln had been saddened by the fact that he couldn't get it all at once, but succeeded nonetheless in getting a great many things for this country by focusing on those goals that were achievable. Perhaps his young questioner would make a much better president than I have. Maybe you will someday. And if so, you will learn that you cannot, just by shouting from the housetops, get what you want all the time. FDR invoking Lincoln as he had was, of course, no coincidence. He revered Lincoln and had studied him closely. Although he hadn't cited the first great quandary Lincoln had faced in his presidency, whether to abandon Fort Sumter, reinforce it, or simply reprovision it, that crisis, had in a way paralleled the question Roosevelt now faced in how aggressively to support Britain in its hour of need. Britain's value to the United States, of course, was strategic, whereas Sumter's value to the country had been symbolic. Nevertheless, hanging in the balance over both presidents at the time of decision was war or peace. Stakes for presidents didn't get any higher than that. Roosevelt's quandary was further complicated by the fact that whereas Lincoln had an election just behind him, FDR's second term was now nearly over, and his own political future was yet another quandary. As you can tell, I was very, very taken by that episode and his invoking of Lincoln to his young audience. They weren't still totally convinced, but I think he made it, there's no question he made an impression on them.